First of all, thank you all for joining us today for today's special edition of the GCDC Virtual Model UN session. We're so excited to have, or to be coordinating this session today with our colleagues from the International Labor Organization, Sarah and Carlton. The International Labor Organization is the UN agency that's been around since 1919 that brings together governments, employers, and workers. So today, you'll be learning a little bit more about what you're representing, whether that be a country, an employer organization, or a worker organization, directly from the experts that we have here that we'll be introducing shortly. And then we'll do a little mini simulation with the placards and the assignments that you've received earlier today. With that, I'll turn it over to Sarah to introduce our speakers for today.
Thanks so much, and it's good to see everyone. Thanks for making and being interested here. I'm Sarah Morgan. I work in the Office for the United States of the International Labor Organization. And we have with us today some of the experts that are actually doing in real life what you're going to be simulating today. So that's great. We have Bob Shepard, who's the Director of the Office of International Labor Affairs at the U.S. Department of Labor. Bob, you want to say hi so everyone can see you?
Hey there, how's everybody doing?
Great. We have Cathy Feingold, who's the Director of the International Department at the AFL-CIO.
Hi everyone, and I love seeing that I already have my AFL-CIO delegate. Welcome to that delegate.
And we have Ronnie Goldberg, who is a Senior Counsel for the U.S. Council for International Business.
Hi, everybody.
So if you've read some of the background on the ILO, you know that it's a little bit different from some of the other UN organizations in that instead of just member states, you have governments as well as worker organizations and employer organizations. So we're really excited to get started with. So I'm going to turn it over to Steve, right, to do more of an interview style to ask some questions of all four of us. Go ahead, Steve.
Yes, so just open to any of the panelists or experts. These are just some general questions that I had. For the first one, when I hear the International Labor Organization or the ILO, my first thought is of international labor unions. And is that what the ILO is?
I will jump in. It is only part of what the ILO is. What's exciting about the ILO is it is tripartite. And like that word sounds, tri, it means it's three parts. It's made up of unions and workers, and then it's made up of employers and business associations, and Ronnie represents them, and governments like Bob Shepard, the US government, and governments from around the world. And it is one of the few global institutions that has those three pieces that come together.
Excellent. Okay. For the second question, so my mom's, one of her best friends works at a clerk's office at a Cleveland courthouse, and another one of her friends is a high school teacher. So I was wondering how the work of the ILO impacts people with jobs like that.
That's a good question. And the answer is it's very hard for us to explain how it might affect people in very specific positions, but the ILO can have an impact on the way countries observe some of the what we call very fundamental principles. For instance, is if your mother or your friend is facing discrimination at work, or whether they're not allowed to join a union as they might choose to, or whether in some cases, and this wouldn't apply to the example you gave, people are forced to work under slave-like conditions, or children are forced to work. The ILO has many conventions which are sort of like international treaties, which bind countries to take effect to make sure these bad practices aren't engaged in. Not all countries, we can't enforce these conditions on all countries, but they sort of set a standard. And most countries that have an interest in protecting their workers make some effort to adhere to the standards that are set by the ILO.
And some of these standards, we don't even think about here. We just take them for granted as though they were like natural. Things like, for the most part, having an 8-hour day or a 40-hour week, or weekends off, or being entitled to time off, or being entitled to a safe place to work. None of these things were automatic. And the ILO is a place where those kinds of standards and those kinds of requirements over the course of its 100-year history have become accepted and normal all around the world.
And Cathy may have more to add, for example, on the teachers aspect or others.
Yeah, on both. So, I mean, your question is a great one. And as a representative of workers' movements, I would say absolutely what we do is we bring the interest of that clerk or that teacher into the debates of the International Labor Organization. The AFL-CIO represents many, many teachers through our American Federation of Teachers. A lot of your teachers are actually in a union, especially in Maryland. If that's where many of you are going to school, you may not know that, but many of them have a union that they're represented by. So one of our jobs is to take what are their concerns about a certain issue and bring them together with the concerns of those auto workers that you were mentioning, or food processing workers, or some of the Amazon workers, and then taking it to the global level. Think of the ILO as creating the global set of rules by which we hope governments and business and workers all play by. It helps us have a common way of understanding what the rules should be in the global economy.
And I'll just add a couple of things. So if I talk about the ILO, we help, just like Cathy said, we help set the international rules. And then two other areas that we look at that are kind of broad, but two other things are, one, research on different areas. So thinking about what's new in the world of work, or what's different, or what things, for example, is Germany. I see Volkswagen as one of the delegates here. What good practices does Germany have that car manufacturers elsewhere might want to have, or companies elsewhere might want to implement? So research and sharing that information, and then helping different workers or employers or governments in different countries change what they're doing to make it more in line with international best practices, international standards. So Steve, that was a very long series of answers to your question, but hit us with the next one.
Yeah, I appreciate that. I appreciate all the different contributions. So the next one is how the ILO deals with issues of discrimination in the workplace, like gender equality, racism, along those lines.
So that is a positive story all of us can share, actually. Not only is one of the main ILO conventions about ending discrimination, which is Convention 111, but just in 2019, business, labor, and many governments came together to create a new convention to end violence and harassment in the workplace. And I encourage all of you, because it was just created, to look at it, because it's really a robust framework for how you end this kind of violence. And at some point in it'd be good to talk about how that happened. I mean, in real time, I had to talk to Bob Shepard and convince him that was a good idea. Talk to Ronnie, and we talked to, so it was a real live process of people questioning why we needed the standard and pushing back on each other. And it really was the spirit of the ILO coming together to really accomplish something that I think has had tremendous impact and has created a lot of hope in countries. To Ronnie's point, we have pretty good laws in the US about discrimination in the workplace, but I forget the exact number now, how many countries have no laws on the books. So what they do is they're going to take this framework and say, hey, the employers, workers, and governments kind of agreed this is the best practice. Let's bring this into our laws. And that's one way that the ILO helps shape national level laws and has impact in workplaces around the world. but that's a really good one. An example of how we all had to work together. Yeah.
And much of what the ILO does, many of the conventions and standards of the ILO deal in fairly specific things. But in that body of work, there are some things that the ILO and the governments and the workers have all long agreed on, and that there are certain principles that are fundamental, that everyone, every sovereign government, everybody who belongs to the ILO needs to adhere to. And those are things like freedom from forced labor, freedom from child labor, the ability to organize and to join unions called freedom of association, but also anti-discrimination. So the question you raised really gets at the heart of what the ILO calls the fundamental principles and rights at work, which every government is expected to adhere to, maybe in slightly different ways. Maybe they have different kinds of legislation, but the basis of that is meant to be universal.
Yeah, I would add that in the question of non-discrimination, there is a mechanism within the ILO pertinent to all the issues where trade unions or work or employer groups can lodge complaints or file complaints alleging discrimination, and the ILO has mechanisms for hearing these complaints and making decisions. It's sometimes difficult to enforce the decisions, but countries that want to be in the main line of international activities often listen carefully to the decisions. With respect to non-discrimination, in recent years, there have been cases against Bahrain, a country in the Middle East, which has a Shiite minority, that alleged that workers of Shiite backgrounds were not treated fairly. There's a case, there was a case against Iran, and there are other cases. So there is an active mechanism where you don't just see a law and say, let's hope they adhere to the standard that's out there, but there's an actual mechanism for taking a case to the ILO and getting a determination made.
Then maybe just one other thing on discrimination. One of the other things that, the US government is a big funder, a donor, and other governments as well for projects in different countries to help them combat discrimination, combat forced labor, combat child labor, promote freedom of association. So it's another thing that the ILO can help do.
Great, thank you. My last question is, what are some of the potentially surprising or unexpected themes that the ILO covers, or things that the ILO does?
I always found that the most surprising thing about the ILO was that it accomplishes so much, indeed anything at all. Because think about it. Think about what you know about negotiations on treaties and things between governments, or what goes on in the UN among governments. You have almost 200 governments in a room with very different interests, and they disagree, and it's hard to organize a discussion, and it's hard to get a consensus. Now imagine the ILO, where it's not just governments sitting around the table, but employers and workers also sitting around the table. So all that complexity and all that potential for disagreement now multiplied to a third degree. And the fact that the ILO has processes and mechanisms and gives the constituents, that's what it calls the workers, the employers and the governments, gives its constituents the space and the support to think these issues through and rely on research and so on, and then the mechanism to actually produce international labor standards, which are international treaties. That's an amazing thing to witness and to participate in the ILO. So I'd say when I first came to the ILO, that was my biggest surprise.
I would say also that there are issues which you see out there, which you think are important, and you think somebody ought to do something about, and sometimes things actually happen. I remember many years ago being in Hong Kong, and every Sunday afternoon for a while, I saw these large groups of young women gathered on the streets, like hundreds or 200s at a time. And I thought this was kind of a social event. It turned out they were domestic workers who came from other Asian countries who were basically locked up in houses for 6 days a week and just had a few hours every Sunday to get together with their compatriots. And then I saw the same thing in Africa, in West Africa. Went to homes, had lots and lots of domestic workers who never got out. And then suddenly in it was about 2010 roughly, the ILO did a convention on decent work for domestic workers. And I was fortunate to be the US delegate to do that and had a chance to actually negotiate that agreement, which was a tremendous step forward. And, it's still not a very highly ratified convention, but it was something. It set an international standard. I was amazed that something which I saw, which I thought was a really big project and nobody had really organized any action on it, was suddenly an ILO issue, and a giant international organization was taking action that actually, these things take time to implement, but sets sort of a basis for addressing the concerns of really tens of millions of people around the world and directly helping to make their lives better. So even though the time frame could be a little long, the fact that action is taken up, accomplished, and then eventually implemented is a great thing. And it's sort of amazing that it happens.
And I would just add to the one thing that Bob and Ronnie just talked about, which is as a workers movement, we actually don't wait for ratification. The US is notorious. We don't ratify a lot of international treaties. And that is something to understand. It's part of just our system, and we can talk about that at a later date. But overall, we're not a country that usually ratifies a lot of these international treaties. But as a workers organization, we still take the framework. So Bob's example of domestic workers, you don't have to go to Hong Kong. The United States, those are some of the lowest paid, unprotected. They're not protected by US labor law in the same way. Those workers, if you look around, have started to organize, and many of them look to the good work that Bob and Ronnie were doing at the ILO for that. They took what came out of that convention and brought it back home and said, here's some really good ways to talk about how we need to improve our working conditions. So it's an example of both, you want countries to ratify, but what gets created, again, those rules of the game are often taken by worker groups and implemented through campaigns and through advocacy work in their various countries.
Can I just add to just something Cathy mentioned? ILO conventions, and there are 190 of them, are basically considered by US law to be treaties. And as treaties, they have to be ratified by the US Senate. They have to be agreed upon by the US Senate. And you all know how easy it is to get things through the US Senate for the past 20 years. I mean, it's impossible except on a few pieces of very major legislation. So it's been a real tough thing to get anything through. The last time we ratified a convention was in 2001, and it was a convention on mine safety and health. And out of 190 conventions, we've ratified a grand total of 14 of them. A lot of European countries have ratified upwards of 90 or 100 of them. So Cathy's absolutely right. We are in a different position than a lot of the countries, but we still, to the extent possible by US law, try to uphold the standards in our own country and in dealing with other countries. And we have no problem advocating that people ratify or consider or use ILO standards as a basis for making law.
And I'll add one last thing, Steve, on the sort of what's most surprising, or what was most surprising when I started learning about the ILO. Two things. One, just the large number and range of different issues that are covered. So you heard a little bit about it just right here, right? Everything from domestic worker rights to maritime labor issues, like working on a ship, to child labor, to occupational safety in mines. So there's just a lot of different things that once you start thinking about, well, what is work and what makes it a good job, or why is it important, that connect to everything. So I thought that was really interesting and kind of surprising, just the whole range of different issues. And then the second thing is just how cool it is when you actually get to go to the ILC, the International Labor Conference, and meet people from around the world who all care about basically the same issue. So I think that's pretty cool, those two things.
Great, thank you. I really appreciate all those answers. That was all my questions, but I'll hand it off to Jay now.
Awesome. Thank you so much, Steve. I think we do have a question from one of the students in the audience from the AFL-CIO. If you want to unmute and ask your question, you can go ahead.
That's a really good question. I mean, if Cathy or Bob, feel free to jump in. So there's no, the ILO doesn't regulate minimum wage. The ILO can't really regulate per se. Like we can't tell a country that it has to be XYZ, but it sets a standard. And minimum wage is one where we don't say a specific amount, but we focus on the process. So our workers and employers and governments all talking to each other about what the wage should be. And does that take into account the conditions that people are working in so that they're good conditions and that they actually get the wage that they're supposed to. But so that's where we focus. Cathy or Ronnie or Bob, I don't know if you have other.
Yeah, I think it's a good explanation. I mean, the labor movement would just say fundamental to all of these issues we talk about is the ability to live with dignity. And I think that is something you'll hear a lot of talk about, something called decent work. And what that means is if you work, whether you're a domestic worker or on that assembly line, or you're a teacher, you should be able to go to work every day, know that you're going to put in your work in a safe place, a place where you can freely speak out about concerns. You can bargain with your employer, and you can know that you can go home and take care of your family. And that's what we mean. The ILO is committed to that, to making sure that you use the tools of the ILO to ensure people live work with dignity. And that's a big thing in the current world we're living in of crisis, right? And so, to the sentiments that Ronnie and Bob have expressed, going to these global fora are super important to know that even though we have differences of opinions, we all agree that people should be able to work and live a life of dignity and have wages that allow them to do that.
Yeah, the ILO does not regulate minimum wages, as has been said, but they will help countries that are interested in setting up a minimum wage, but don't have experience on how to do it, to implement that type of system. And a recent example was the country of Qatar, QATAR. It's a Middle Eastern country, it has a lot of oil, and it has over 2 million migrant workers living in the country and working in the country, and only 300,000 resident workers. And they, under working with the ILO, determined that the migrant workers living in the country were entitled to a minimum wage. And they're taking steps now using ILO technical assistance to implement that system, which is really an important step for so many people who are working there.
The reason the process is so important is that, of course, the minimum wage is not going to be the same everywhere in the world because economic conditions are different. Cost of living is different and so on. So it's very important to know what should be the factors and the processes that go into determining what's a good level for that particular country under those particular circumstances.
That's a great question, AFL-CIO. I know you're already on my team because the labor movement definitely believes that we need a global standard on occupation safety and health precisely during this time of crisis that the pandemic has underscored that. And this is an issue we don't agree on. So that's a great example that, the workers put forward at the last governing body, that we believe that this is something that really needs to be prioritized immediately. And so there you begin the debates about how you move that through the ILO system. But absolutely, AFL-CIO, that is top of our agenda. I feel like you and I already are seeing eye to eye. And I promised Bob and Ronnie we did not coordinate before this call.
So the ILO actually has two conventions that do, two very important conventions that deal with safety and health. One is very specific and one in general calls for all countries to have a national safety and health institution and to be responsive and to promote safety and health issues. And I think this latter one, were we to have an agreeable Senate, we could probably easily ratify. The other one, I think, poses some issues for some folks in the United States, but I think it is an important issue. It's something where the ILO, in terms of its programs and its technical programs, does some great work with countries. It's something we've encouraged them to increase their capacity to do work on. You know, what Cathy was referring to was actually amending the declaration Ronnie referred to earlier, which talks about 4 fundamental principles, which I think I enumerated: freedom of association, non-discrimination, child labor, and forced labor. And would add safety and health as a 5th principle. And that discussion will begin in March, and we'll see how it plays out.
I think, though, it's also important to remember that conventions, these international treaties, are the highest form of action at the ILO, but they're not the only form. So the ILO can also come up with recommendations to governments on particular issues, which are usually quite detailed and could provide a roadmap for governments wanting to take action or needing to bolster their activities in a certain area. It can, as Cathy noted earlier, provide technical assistance and information and research. So it's not just a one-trick pony with respect to the ways in which it helps governments deal with particular issues.
And on COVID, and we can send some of the links on this if anyone's super interested, but on COVID, we also had a global conference in July that a lot of governments participated in to, as you heard from Cathy, talk about different positions and different strategies, because some governments responded differently. You know, the US government gave a lot of unemployment insurance or subsidies as well, not insurance, but some other governments paid businesses to keep people employed on their books. So they supplemented it in that way. So there are just different ways that countries dealt with it. And so that the ILO helped at least provide that information on what worked and what didn't work in different countries. And it continues to do that as well.
The ILO, by the way, estimated that something like 2.5 million people die every year from either accidents or work-related deaths. And in this era of COVID, I think that's probably gone up quite a bit. It's something like 6,000 deaths a day, something in that area. I'd have to check the statistics, but it's a pretty serious issue. And, you know, and those are avoidable.
And I do think the pandemic, this is one of the big questions. Can the ILO show that it is able to react to the crisis of the moment? And that is, you know, that is one of the urgencies that the labor movement is putting forward in March, that beyond the traditional occupational safety and health deaths, that this is really something that is challenging every single country of the world. And we should have a set of global rules everyone knows how to play by. And that's what's really, you know, our own country, I'll just end by saying our own country has resisted creating a national set of rules. And when you don't have a set of rules, people don't quite know how to play. You know, do you wear a mask? Do you not? Do you do, you know? And so that's why you can see at the global level, it would be so important to have these set of global rules.